Hello and welcome back to Report of Silver, where we break down the biggest developments in the gold and silver markets and uncover what is really happening behind the headlines. If you follow silver closely, then today's story is one you absolutely cannot ignore, because what just happened in Washington may end up being remembered as one of the most important developments in the silver market in years. Congress has now introduced something called the Silver Act. And at first glance, it might sound like just another piece of legislation buried in the endless stream of political headlines. But when you actually study what this bill is about, what language is being used, and why lawmakers are suddenly focusing on silver infrastructure, it starts to become very clear that this is much bigger than price action. This is not simply about whether silver goes to $40, $50, or $100. This is about strategic control. This is about national security.
This is about governments recognizing that silver may no longer be just another commodity. It may now be viewed as a strategic national asset. That is the first thing investors need to understand. For years, silver has been treated by most of the financial world as just another metal. It was often discussed as gold's little brother, a volatile precious metal that retail investors buy during inflation scares or economic uncertainty. But behind the scenes, silver has quietly become one of the most important industrial metals on the planet. It sits at the center of modern civilization in a way very few people truly understand. Silver is inside solar panels, electric vehicles, artificial intelligence hardware, semiconductor systems, advanced military electronics, medical devices, telecommunications infrastructure, satellites, and defense systems. Every year, the industrial world becomes more dependent on silver, not less. Demand continues rising, while supply struggles to keep pace. That alone should have gotten lawmakers' attention years ago, but now something has changed. Now Congress is stepping directly into the silver conversation. Whenever governments suddenly become interested in a commodity, investors need to ask one question: why now? Why are lawmakers suddenly discussing silver vaults, depository systems, storage resiliency, and national infrastructure? Why are they suddenly worried about where physical silver is stored? Why are they worried about geographic concentration risk? Why are they suddenly using words like national security when talking about precious metals? Those are not random phrases. Governments choose their words carefully. They especially choose them carefully when discussing legislation tied to strategic resources. That is why this story matters so much. Something has changed in how policymakers are viewing silver, and that should immediately get every investor's attention. The bill itself is called the System Integrity Through Licensed Vault Expansion and Resilience Act, better known as the Silver Act, officially filed as H.R. 807. Even the name tells you what this is really about. System integrity means lawmakers believe there is a weakness in the current system. Vault expansion means they believe current storage infrastructure is inadequate. Resilience means they are preparing for disruption. That is the language of risk management. That is the language used when institutions believe vulnerabilities already exist. In other words, this bill is not simply proactive. It suggests Congress sees an existing problem that needs to be addressed immediately. And what is that problem? The current U.S. precious metal storage system is heavily concentrated around New York and the COMEX system. For those unfamiliar, COMEX is the largest silver futures exchange in the United States and arguably the most influential silver pricing mechanism in the world. The global paper price of silver largely flows through COMEX futures contracts. But here is the issue many people don't understand. Most of the silver traded on COMEX is paper silver, not physical silver. Contracts are bought and sold in enormous quantities every single day, often representing hundreds of millions of ounces. But only a tiny fraction of those contracts ever result in physical delivery. That is how the system has operated for decades. It works because most participants never ask for the metal. That structure has led critics for years to argue that silver prices are artificially suppressed. If paper contracts can be created in unlimited quantities, then price pressure can be managed without requiring equivalent physical metal. Many longtime analysts have argued this is exactly what has happened. That is why so many investors refer to COMEX as paper silver. The real concern is that if too many participants suddenly demanded delivery, the system could be exposed. That risk has always existed in theory, but lawmakers now appear to be acknowledging another problem: physical concentration risk. Right now, most approved silver depositories tied to COMEX are located within roughly 150 miles of New York City. Think about that for a moment. One region controls a massive amount of the nation's strategic silver storage infrastructure. If there were a major cyber attack, a natural disaster, a regional grid failure, a transportation shutdown, or even a security event, that concentration could create enormous disruption. Lawmakers are now openly admitting that this is a vulnerability. That is exactly why the Silver Act was introduced. Officially, they say they want to modernize the storage system and reduce systemic risk. But beneath that language lies something much more important: an acknowledgement that silver infrastructure matters enough to protect. That alone is historic. This may be the first time Congress has publicly treated silver not merely as an investment product, but as a strategic resource tied directly to infrastructure resilience and national security. That changes the entire conversation, because once governments begin viewing a resource strategically, policy priorities change, regulation changes, storage rules change, supply chain policy changes, national stockpiling can begin, strategic reserve discussions can begin, export controls can begin. Suddenly, the silver market stops being just a market, it becomes policy. And if that happens, silver investors need to understand one thing very clearly. The world may be entering a completely different silver era. This may only be the beginning. Now that we understand what the Silver Act officially claims to do, we need to go much deeper, because this is where the story becomes even more important. On the surface, lawmakers are saying this bill is about reducing risk by expanding the number of approved silver depositories across the United States. They want licensed vaults not just concentrated near New York, but spread across the Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific time zones. That sounds practical, and honestly, it is. From a logistics perspective, it makes perfect sense. If physical silver can be stored in more regions, transportation becomes easier, costs go down, and access improves for investors, producers, refiners, and institutions. That is the public explanation, and it is true. But if you stop there, you miss the much bigger story. The real question is this: why does Congress suddenly care so much about where silver is stored? Why now? For decades, this concentrated vault structure existed without major political concern. COMEX operated this way for years. Investors accepted it, institutions accepted it, regulators accepted it. Nobody in Washington seemed interested. Then suddenly, lawmakers are calling it a national vulnerability. That shift in language is not accidental. It tells us something important has changed behind the scenes. When governments begin discussing concentration risk, they are usually thinking about worst-case scenarios. They are not talking about everyday inconvenience. They are talking about events that could cripple systems. They are talking about disruptions that could shut down critical infrastructure. Think about the language used in the bill itself. It specifically references natural disasters, cyber incidents, national emergencies, and security threats. That is not normal commodity market language. That is strategic planning language. That is resilience planning. That is how governments prepare when they believe an asset is too important to fail. And that leads us directly back to silver's growing strategic importance. 10 years ago, many people still thought of silver mainly as jewelry, coins, and bars. Today, that view is outdated. Silver is now deeply embedded in modern technology. It is essential in solar energy systems, where photovoltaic panels require silver paste to conduct electricity efficiently. It is essential in electric vehicles, which use more silver than traditional vehicles because of their advanced electrical systems. It is essential in semiconductors, data centers, and artificial intelligence hardware. And perhaps most importantly, it is critical in defense technology. Silver appears in military electronics, communication systems, radar, advanced sensors, guidance systems, and aerospace engineering. It is used because it is the most conductive metal on Earth. Nothing performs quite like silver. When reliability matters, engineers choose silver. That means if military planners are thinking about future readiness, they are also thinking about silver availability. They have to. A shortage of silver does not just affect investors. It affects defense capability, manufacturing capability, and energy infrastructure. That may explain why lawmakers suddenly sound so serious. This may not simply be about making storage more convenient. This may be about securing access to a critical material before it becomes harder to obtain. Governments do not usually wait until a crisis becomes obvious. They move quietly beforehand. They create frameworks. They adjust infrastructure. They pass legislation. They prepare systems so they are ready when stress arrives. That is why this bill deserves so much attention. Now let's talk about another angle that many people are missing. If more vaults are approved across the country, especially in western states where much of America's mining and refining occurs, that creates more than just convenience. It creates decentralization. That matters because decentralization reduces dependence on one system. And when you reduce dependence on one system, you also reduce that system's power. That is where COMEX enters the conversation again. For years, critics have argued that COMEX has too much control over silver pricing. The global silver price is largely discovered through futures contracts, not through physical buying and selling. That means paper contracts often dictate price more than real-world supply and demand. Many investors believe that creates distortions. They believe physical silver should command a much higher price than what the paper market currently suggests. Now imagine what happens if silver storage becomes geographically broader and easier to access. More physical participants may choose to hold metal outside the traditional New York system. More regional vaulting means more alternatives. More alternatives mean less dependency on the central exchange model. That could gradually weaken COMEX's dominance. It would not happen overnight, but it could begin shifting power away from a highly centralized system. That possibility is one reason this legislation feels so important. Whether lawmakers intended it or not, the Silver Act could start exposing the imbalance between paper silver and physical silver. If physical storage expands, if regional demand strengthens, and if more investors choose direct ownership over paper exposure, the market structure itself could begin changing. And remember, this is happening during a period when silver fundamentals are already tightening. Industrial demand continues climbing. Renewable energy demand continues climbing. Military demand continues climbing. Mine supply growth remains weak. New discoveries are limited. Recycling helps, but not enough. In simple terms, the supply side is not expanding nearly as fast as demand. That creates pressure. Pressure creates vulnerability. Vulnerability forces governments to pay attention. That may be exactly what we are seeing right now. The Silver Act may look like a simple infrastructure bill, but when you connect all the dots, it starts looking much bigger. It starts looking like early-stage strategic positioning. And if that interpretation is correct, then this legislation is not the end of the story. It may be the beginning of a much larger policy shift around silver. Now let's talk about what may be the most important hidden message inside the Silver Act. And that is what it appears to say about the current state of the physical silver market. Because whenever governments introduce legislation around infrastructure, storage, and resilience, they are indirectly admitting that something in the current system may not be as strong as people think. That is what investors need to understand. Governments do not usually spend time rewriting rules for systems they believe are perfectly stable. They do it when they see vulnerabilities, weaknesses, or risks that could become much larger problems later. And in the case of silver, those risks may already be building. For years, many silver analysts have argued that there is a growing disconnect between paper silver and physical silver. On paper, everything looks fine. Trading volume is enormous. Liquidity appears strong. Markets seem functional. But when you look at the physical side, the story starts changing. We have seen repeated signs of stress in physical supply chains over the past several years. Delivery delays have happened. Premiums have surged. Inventory movements between vaults have accelerated. Lease rates have spiked at times, signaling tightness in the lending market. And every time physical demand increases suddenly, the system appears to strain. That matters because the silver market is relatively small compared to many other global markets. It does not take an enormous shift in demand to create major pressure. A few large institutional buyers moving toward physical delivery can have an outsized impact. A surge in industrial demand can tighten supply faster than people expect. A geopolitical event can change flows overnight. Silver is not like oil, where supply can sometimes adjust more quickly. Silver mine production is slow to respond. New mines take years to develop. Existing producers cannot simply flip a switch and dramatically increase output. That means when pressure builds, the market becomes vulnerable. Now think about that in the context of the Silver Act. If lawmakers are worried about depository concentration and system resilience, they may not just be worried about convenience. They may be worried about what happens if physical demand accelerates and existing infrastructure cannot handle it efficiently. That is a very different type of concern. That is not a routine policy update. That is a strategic warning. And there is another issue here that deserves attention: trust. Financial markets operate on trust. COMEX works because market participants trust that the system functions. They trust that contracts can settle. They trust that delivery mechanisms work. They trust that inventory reports reflect reality. But if that trust starts weakening, behavior changes quickly. Investors who were comfortable with paper exposure may suddenly want physical metal. Institutions that were satisfied with synthetic exposure may begin asking for direct allocation. That shift can happen much faster than people realize. History teaches us this lesson again and again. Markets often look calm until trust breaks. Then everything changes. We saw it in banking crises. We saw it in bond markets. We saw it in housing. And precious metals are no different. Once enough participants begin asking the same question, do I actually own the metal? The system can be tested in ways it was never designed for. That is why physical silver investors pay so much attention to vault data. They watch registered inventory levels. They watch eligible inventory. They monitor exchange withdrawals. They study flows between major storage hubs like COMEX and London Bullion Market Association, because those numbers tell a story beneath the headline price. Sometimes the price looks quiet, while the physical market tells a very different story. Quiet prices do not always mean quiet conditions. Now consider another possibility. If the U.S. government increasingly views silver as strategically important, that could eventually influence how much silver remains available to ordinary investors. Governments can prioritize industrial users. Governments can encourage domestic retention. Governments can influence export policies. Governments can reshape incentives around production and storage. We have already seen countries around the world become more protective of critical resources. Nations are stockpiling energy. They are stockpiling rare earths. They are securing food supplies. They are protecting strategic minerals. Why would silver be any different if policymakers now see it as essential infrastructure? That is where this story starts becoming much bigger than a single bill. If silver is entering the strategic asset category, then market rules could gradually evolve around that reality. We may see more government involvement. We may see more industrial prioritization. We may see stronger domestic supply chain policies. We may even see future discussions around strategic reserves. Those are not guarantees, but once the conversation begins, possibilities expand, and that is why I believe the Silver Act is so important. It may not immediately change silver prices tomorrow. It may not create an instant market event next week, but it tells us how policymakers are thinking. It reveals where attention is shifting, and when governments begin paying attention to physical silver, serious investors should be paying attention too, because this is how major market transitions often begin. Quietly, through policy language, before most people realize what is happening. By the time the broader public notices, the market narrative has usually already changed. Silver may now be entering that exact kind of transition. Now let's focus on what this could mean for the future of silver pricing, because this is where the Silver Act becomes much more than a political headline and starts becoming a potential market catalyst. A lot of people hear about legislation like this and immediately ask one question: will this make silver go up? That is the natural question, but the better question is this: does this change how the market functions? Because if the market structure changes, then price eventually follows. That is how real transformations happen. They rarely begin with a sudden price spike. They begin with infrastructure changes, regulatory changes, and shifts in how participants interact with the system. If the Silver Act succeeds in expanding approved depositories across the United States, that immediately changes one important thing. Access to physical silver becomes easier. That may sound simple, but it has huge implications. Right now, the concentration of approved vaults near New York creates bottlenecks. It increases transportation costs, storage fees, and logistical friction. Smaller investors, regional institutions, and even producers often face unnecessary barriers because of this centralized structure. If those barriers are reduced, participation can increase. More participation means more physical demand. More physical demand means more pressure on available supply. That is the part many investors underestimate. Silver is already operating in a market where industrial demand is climbing aggressively. Solar continues consuming large amounts of silver every year. Electric vehicles continue scaling globally. Artificial intelligence systems require more advanced electronics, which means more silver usage. Defense systems continue modernizing. Data centers continue expanding. None of those trends appear to be slowing down. In fact, most of them are accelerating. That means the silver market is already under demand pressure before retail investors even enter the picture. Now imagine adding stronger investor access to physical metal on top of that. Suddenly, what looked like a manageable supply-demand balance can become much tighter. That is how shortages develop, not necessarily because supply disappears overnight, but because demand expands faster than the system was built to handle. This is also where premiums become important. Investors often focus only on the spot price, but premiums tell a deeper story. Premiums rise when physical availability tightens. We have already seen this happen several times in recent years. Spot silver may say one thing, but when local dealers start charging significantly more, that tells you physical conditions are changing. If the Silver Act encourages more physical ownership and broader participation, premiums could become an even more important signal going forward. Now let's talk about price discovery, because this may be the most overlooked part of the entire story. Today, silver prices are primarily discovered in the paper market, especially through COMEX futures contracts. That means billions of dollars of price influence come from contracts, not direct metal exchange. Critics have argued for years that this disconnect suppresses silver's true value. Whether you fully agree with that or not, it is undeniable that paper dominates pricing. But what happens if physical participation grows? What happens if more investors demand direct ownership instead of paper exposure? What happens if more vaults across the country create easier physical access and encourage regional silver movement? Slowly, physical demand begins asserting more influence. That does not mean paper disappears. It means the balance shifts. And if the balance shifts toward physical, price discovery can begin reflecting real-world scarcity more accurately. That is when silver can behave very differently. Historically, silver is known for explosive moves. It often remains quiet for long periods, then suddenly moves faster than most people expect. We saw that in 2011. We saw it in earlier historical cycles. Silver has a habit of frustrating investors during the waiting period and then shocking them during the breakout period. That volatility is part of its nature. But those explosive moves usually happen when multiple forces align: strong demand, tight supply, investor attention, and a catalyst. Could the Silver Act become one of those catalysts? It is possible. Even if this bill does not directly push prices higher tomorrow, it changes perception. It tells the market that lawmakers believe silver infrastructure matters. It signals that silver is strategically important enough to warrant federal attention. That kind of validation matters psychologically. Institutions notice that. Large investors notice that. Mining companies notice that. Markets respond not just to numbers, but to narratives. And the silver narrative may now be evolving from speculative precious metal to strategic industrial asset. That is a major shift, and if that narrative continues building, then silver may begin attracting a different class of buyer. Not just retail stackers, not just traders, but strategic investors, institutions, and even governments looking at long-term positioning. Once that begins, the market can look very different. This is why I keep saying, this story is bigger than most people realize. The Silver Act is not just a bill about vault locations. It may be an early sign that silver is entering a new phase, one where physical control matters more, where infrastructure matters more, and where governments are beginning to quietly prepare for a world in which silver becomes too important to ignore. As we wrap this up, I want to bring everything back to the biggest takeaway from this story, because sometimes when legislation like this gets introduced, people immediately focus on the details and miss the broader message. Yes, the Silver Act is officially about expanding licensed silver depositories. Yes, it is about reducing concentration risk around New York and improving access across the country. Yes, it is about making the physical silver market more resilient in the event of a national emergency, cyber attack, or major disruption. All of that is true, but the deeper message is much bigger than that. The deeper message is that the United States government is now openly acknowledging that physical silver matters strategically. That is the story. For decades, silver investors have argued that silver is undervalued, misunderstood, and often ignored by mainstream financial markets. Most people only notice silver when the price spikes. Most media outlets only mention silver when it becomes volatile. Most institutional investors treat it as a small portfolio hedge at best. But behind the scenes, silver has been becoming more important every single year. Industrial demand has exploded. Strategic applications have expanded. Global supply has struggled to keep up. And now, for the first time, lawmakers are beginning to publicly reflect that reality. That should tell you something. Governments do not move quickly, but when they do move, it usually means internal conversations have already been happening for a long time. Bills like this do not appear out of nowhere. Staffers study them. Committees discuss them. Industry experts weigh in. Risks are evaluated. Language is carefully drafted. By the time legislation is introduced, the concern is already real. That means the Silver Act may not be the start of this conversation in Washington. It may simply be the first public sign that the conversation has already been happening privately, and that should make investors think very carefully about where silver may be heading next. Could this eventually lead to larger strategic policies around silver? Possibly. Could it lead to stronger domestic production incentives? It could. Could it lead to more government oversight of silver infrastructure? Absolutely. Could it eventually influence how silver flows across borders, or how much is retained domestically? That is not impossible either. Once a resource enters the national security conversation, policy possibilities expand very quickly. We have already seen this happen in other sectors. Countries around the world are protecting energy supplies. They are protecting rare earth metals. They are protecting semiconductor manufacturing. They are building redundancy into critical supply chains. That is the world we live in now. Resilience has become a national priority. Strategic independence has become a national priority. Silver appears to be entering that same category. And if that happens, then the silver market of the next decade may look very different from the silver market of the last decade.